Good afternoon, folks. I'm back again. It's Ross Weaver here to do another one of my Metal Gear Solid V Explained lectures. This will be number 25. It's entitled, Why is Quiet? We'll be going over just a bunch of stuff about Quiet's character and related stuff to her story and all that kind of thing and what she's about. And I'm going to, like I've said this earlier, I was going to do this lecture, kind of get on my soapbox a little bit and kind of I don't want to get too holier than thou or anything like that, but I'm gonna talk a little bit about how I feel like a lot of people sort of treat her character poorly. Let's just say that. And with that said, let's get started. So the thing that goes around the most about Quiet when you bring her up online or you see her brought up online, and kind of the prevailing sentiment and the masses have that I see, is that she's just an excuse for Kojima to have a chick in a bikini in his game. And, I don't think that's entirely inaccurate. And, even if I do, it's like most people still think that. So let's just go with that for a bit and kind of start there. In a way, having a woman in your game as a character who's scantily clad is it is gonna be a thing where you're putting a chick in a bikini for this role. So it's like you kind of can't say that's wrong, to me. In a way, her state of dress is kind of the point, though, which we'll get to. Now, I've said in all my lectures, if you followed along, that Hideo is likened to Chico in the symbolism of the game, and Hideo's path kind of is similar to Chico's path. And so, in the same way that Quiet is kind of just an excuse to have a hot chick in a bikini in your game, this is literally kind of true on the level of the game for Chico, though. Now, it gets into crazy stuff, the parasite metamorphosis process, essentially, what happened when the bomb went off after Ground Zeroes. I've talked about in my other videos that I think Paz and Chico were together, that essentially she had a bomb left in her, and this was after most of the MSF Peace Walker version of the offshore base had been sunk into the sea, and there was some platforms that were left, and Zero, as Kaz, was up in the chopper with Snake, who's really Fox, and they're in the corner chatting about what to do, and I think Fox has secretly put a bomb into Paz, because Fox is probably the only one who would know to do this at this point. That's ultimately what I think it gets down to. And I think it was the older version of him that put this bomb in her, which gets back to the whole Hellbound mission where we get the models poster and all that stuff. So when Paz jumps out, like I've talked about in the not a quiet exit, but the Cloaked in Silence mission where she jumps out and Snake is just kind of sitting there watching it happen. And if you think about how often when we deploy, how Snake is just kind of sitting on the side of the chopper, just jumping out all the time. Like we see his fall all the time, right? It's kind of there in front of us, but it's all cut up. And I think he falls again when Paz jumps out and the two of them go out together, and then the bomb goes off, and then the parasites do their crazy metamorphosis thing. Because Chico already had some parasite stuff implanted into him, and because Paz herself is fully she's sort of like the parasite queen in a way. She just is parasite, in a way. So that's, again, that excuse me, that goes back to why Quiet's powers are the way they are. Why she can sort of explode her body and sort of disintegrate it at will, and then reform it. That's presumably what happened. That's what we see in the Cloaked in Silence cutscene, is where she jumps out, kind of blows up in midair, and then reforms after she hits the deck. And she's kind of still there when she hits the deck, even though she's invisible. Excuse me. So when Quiet jumps out and blows up, Chico's there with her. And presumably the two of them would have transformed in midair, like I kind of theorized first happened to make the Cobras. And the sort of changes that happened to them would have been determined by the sort of memetics of what was in their mind and what they were feeling at the time. Sort of the motivations behind why they were doing what they were doing when they blew up. So that's probably, like I said, why Chico probably turns into kind of a crazy killing machine. Um, but it's also probably why Quiet turns into an attractive woman. The two of them were children, sort of in their child forms before this explosion, and after they would have presumably been mature, because that's what the metaphor says, right? Caterpillar to butterfly, sort of larva to chrysalis to this whole transformation, being emblematic of puberty and coming into adulthood. You have to consider sexuality as part of that. These kids have hormones raging in them like crazy. And it's not necessarily a bad or unnatural thing to be attracted to someone else, right? To see that as a bad thing is kind of the bad thing, right? And so in a way, Chico's extremely attracted to Paz, right? And the two of them being adults, versions of each other, presumably there was kind of a mutual desire for sort of wish fulfillment between the two, where since she's kind of already fully parasite and he's in the explosion with her, his human desires would have played in very strongly for what would have happened in her metamorphosis. And so it's like at the end of the Quiet Exit mission when she gives you the tape and you listen to it, and the first thing she says is, "I did not choose to be quiet." This is, I think, what she means. It wasn't really her choice to take on the form that she ended up in. It was mostly kind of little Ricardo's fault, actually. I think, and it came out of kind of an immature desire that he had, and his attraction to her and stuff like that, to Pause, really. But, this all kind of relates back to, stuff that everybody, I think, can relate to. When you were a kid, the first people you were attracted to, maybe at a certain age, you started getting some presumably kind of inappropriate sexual desires, and you have to deal with that, right? Well, here it was like we kind of get to see all the internal processes become external processes. And so all that internal, stuff that you go through whenever you're, just growing up and going through puberty and dealing with all those hormones, it's kind of quite literally happening here for Quiet and Chico. I say Quiet and Chico. It's really Quiet and Venom, because Venom would have been kind of I think that's also plays into why he looks like Snake. I think, obviously, given Paz's history, if she's really the Joy, she's probably fairly attached to the Snake idea and the Snake persona. If not the specific guy of Naked Snake, if he's become like kind of a jerk by this point, she's probably still kind of attracted to this idea of Snake, and maybe that's why, partially why at least, Chico ended up becoming sort of like a snake, right? So that kind of covers the metamorphosis and sort of Chico's kind of immature desire in that, role, the role that Chico's immature desire played in that whole metamorphosis. But we also have to consider this is not just about the characters. This is also about, it's kind of a meta thing, right? So it's got to be about the audience from a certain perspective too, because we are Venom Snake. My dogs say hi. Excuse me. So since we are Venom Snake and we kind of are Chico, we have to understand this is kind of about our own misogyny in a way. This kind of overbearing focus on certain kinds of feminine appearances, right? A lot of image stuff in Hollywood today is kind of rooted in a lot of misogyny, and we don't really talk about it. Because a lot of people are kind of okay with it, It's kind of a terrible thing. I finally just watched Mulholland Drive the other day. I'd tried to watch it sometime in the past and didn't get through it because it was a late night and I shouldn't have tried to watch it. It's a long movie, And like literally the next day after I was trying to watch it, it went off the service it was on. I was just like, oh my God. So I finally watched it the other day and it feels kind of appropriate. That movie's been on my mind a lot while I've been thinking about this lecture. A lot of how that story in Mulholland Drive is kind of built off of the sort of internalized misogyny that's already there. And it's not maybe necessarily as much about the misogyny as you think it is, so much as it uses the misogyny as a way to tell its story, if that makes sense. So, in that way, yes, Quiet's appearance, she didn't totally get to choose to be who she was. But I think, like she says in the end of that whole speech, she's thankful for the opportunities that she got. I don't think she would necessarily take back all the stuff that happened, and that's why this whole thing of redacted mutiny and things being covered up is another thing that we kind of have to deal with in this game. But what it really gets down to is we kind of don't respect her choices. Is kind of what it gets down to. If you look at the way a lot of people treat her character, they kind of don't respect the choices that she's made and the things that she's said in the game. They don't reinforce those things. They'll say things about her character that are quite literally the opposite of what she's saying and doing in the game. And I don't want to get too specific because it'll sound like I've got personal vendettas, and I kind of do, but this is not about that. It's just about how, generally speaking, audiences in Western media a lot of times don't really respect women. They look at women characters a lot differently than they look at male characters, and they think the motivations for what a male character should do at a certain juncture would be totally different for what a female character should do at that juncture, which is sometimes understandable, but sometimes kind of screwed up. Sometimes it's not really, let's say, a useful thing. It comes just kind of from misogyny, just from hating women. And I don't think I need to talk too much about how American culture hates women right now when abortion and stuff like that's going on with what just happened in Texas and Kentucky. Come on. So anyways, but I also want to mention how Stephanie Joosten's talked about doing the role of Quiet, and she's been asked point blank how did she feel about dressing up like this and doing all this stuff, and she said she was fine with it. She said it's maybe a little more extreme than what she would have written for a character like this, but she's also not the person who came up with this stuff, and she respects the stuff that they came up with. She sees the sort of the value in her character being depicted that way. And if she said that in interviews, what's wrong with everybody else not seeing that? You see what I'm saying? It's got to be misogyny, basically. If it comes down to lack of an understanding, well, it's gonna basically take its form as misogyny. So if it quacks like a duck, so in a way, Quiet's character in Metal Gear Solid V: The Phantom Pain is kind of a litmus test, or you might call it a Bechdel test, for your own kind of ability to perceive why a character is doing what they're doing in the narrative. And I'll get back to this stuff at the end of the lecture when we talk about just what her story is and her motives are for going through all the stuff that she goes through in the game. But we have to talk about some of this stuff first and kind of get it in minds, and then I'll get there. But she's, like I said, she's kind of a test that you kind of have to go through to be able to properly perceive why she's doing what she's doing. On kind of a literal, practical level, she's not going to tell you all the answers that you want to know. She's going to be quiet. She under all that duress and the torture scenes that she goes through, she never once talks, right? She's not going to give herself up to us. We're going to have to figure it out for ourselves in this game, why she is the way she is. So that's why I'm doing this whole lecture. But on another kind of practical level, pause in the game is quite literally a self-made obstruction. Whenever we go to the pause sort of medical room, that whole room is a hallucination, so it's self-made. Pause herself and all of her dialogue and all that stuff that we perceive in there, everything that Miller and Ocelot says too, those are all things that Venom came up with in his own mind and kind of told himself. They're not really things that happened. So to Venom, pause is sort of his own self-made obstruction in the story for progression and growth and coming to understanding why things are the way they are. Quite literally, peace is the thing keeping you away from peace. It's kind of a little ironic in this case. It's really about man versus nature, and really the part of yourself that is that nature, fighting that part of yourself, the impulse to sort of think that you've got it right, and you've got to be the sort of the hero that you think you are. That's something you kind of everybody has to cope with in their life, and learn that you're not the main character, right? And it's kind of about your ego and your ability to let go of a situation or just something that you're a part of and not have to define all the parts of it yourself. To let self-determination be a thing for other things, essentially. That's kind of what all this is about. And why Quiet's narrative is, again, the way it is. So, I've talked enough about it. Let's get into it. What is her narrative? Well, we're told that she's Cypher's assassin. That's kind of the thing that's repeated throughout the game. In Cloaked in Silence, that's what she's called. I think, again, in Quiet Exit, she's called Cypher's assassin, possibly, at some point. But specifically, she's called Skullface's assassin. That Skullface was using her as a vector in case his assassination plan failed. Now, his assassination plan is not like what we think it is. He is kind of going after Zero, but that's all stuff I've covered in the Skullface mission, what his true target is. So he's kind of going after the plot of Metal Gear, right? He's kind of trying to assassinate a certain character, actually. Well, he has, actually. Anyways, but Quiet is, here as a vector. That's kind of the important part. She's like this extra vector. So what that relates to is how every time you've got a cutscene in this game where Quiet can be part of it, there's also a version of it where she's not part of it, right? So whether she's with you or not determines the state of that cutscene at the end of like the Sahelanthropus mission and that big hero walk. If she's just not on the base, she won't be there in that hero walk. If you don't have her as a buddy in certain missions, she won't be in certain scenes. There's sort of like alternate versions of a lot of these cutscenes in this game, depending on whether or not she's with you, either in terms of being on the base, or whether or not she's with you in terms of being your buddy. Now, the reason that's all there is so that literally there's a vector for recreating certain narratives that you wouldn't be able to recreate otherwise if it was just Venom out there on his own. Venom and Quiet together kind of create another sort of like way to recreate certain narratives, right? Literally in the past of Metal Gear, like chase scenes and stuff like that feature a man and a woman. And I've talked about that stuff ad nauseum already, though, in all the other lectures. So that's kind of, it's like, don't think of her as a vector for assassination so much as a vector for like certain stories to be able to be told at all, right? It's still up to you to put those pieces together and actually make it happen, but she's kind of like the vector for that, for certain versions of these stories. And with that said, I got to mention how there's a way to play through this game where you can completely cut Quiet from the narrative, and it kind of breaks the game, actually. And I think you're kind of meant to do this in order to have your attention drawn to some of the artifice that's in the game, because it helps you figure out some of the lies. If the first time you play through this game, you get to Cloaked in Silence and you beat Quiet, and you shoot her and kill her, and you just keep playing, and you never go back and recruit her, you can actually go all the way to Mission 46 without using her, without recruiting her. What'll happen is you'll go through up to Mission 40, you get Mission 39 done, and Mission 40 just doesn't show up in your list of missions, and you go on and you get 41, which is Proxy War Without End. 40 ends up becoming kind of an optional mission and just doesn't show up in this version of the game. And then later on, of course, you won't get Mission 45 either, but you don't really need that because 46 is really your ending, right? It's kind of where the game counts your completion stuff, right? So in this way, with missions 40 and 45 being optional, it's like Quiet can be completely cut from the game. And so all those cutscenes that you see on the base after the language virus, or right before the language virus is about to break out, where she tackles a guy and tries to stab him in his throat with a knife. Of course, she's trying to do that because he's got the vocal cord parasite, and she knows it, and she's trying to stop it. Of course, she can't, because she's not allowed to, because Venom stops her. But there's the other scene where later on, when you've got the children at the base, she'll go after the lion necklace. I think that was thrown down in the area that's being cleaned by Eli. She'll go and get it at great personal risk, actually. And it's kind of a big scene. And that scene's actually teased in the whole, like, at the end of part 1, after you finish Mission 31, they show you a little, like, teaser for part 2 kind of thing for the, like it's a TV show, you're going to get, like, a preview of season 2 or something like that. And they show you that scene where Venom's pulling Quiet out, and he's got her in his arms, and she's all covered in burns and smoking and stuff, all the chemical burns and stuff. That scene quite literally didn't happen when I most recently played through this game, because I cut her from the narrative, and she just never had to deal with that because the kids left the base. I finished the story, and then I went and recruited her. And so, it kind of breaks open this game's whole narrative when you've got all of this stuff that they're trying to blame on her when you play through the game when you've got her. All that stuff they try to blame on her, and all this, like, oh, she's really here doing Skullface's work behind the scenes and blah, blah, blah. If you can kind of just take all that out of the game, which you quite literally can, you'll see quite easily that Code Talker, Ocelot, and Miller, and others are lying their butts off to you all the time about a whole lot of stuff. And once you can kind of break their narrative, you can kind of break their story via this method of interrogation, you can come to see all these lies and come to see what the real truth is, like I've been talking about how Venom's really Fox and Chico. So, with all that said, that's why Skullface has got her here as a vector, really, essentially. She's here as a way so you can sort of like have her there or not there, as a way of sort of exposing some of the more artificial stuff within the actual story itself. It's not like bad writing so much as it's the characters within the story have created a fabrication, and they're selling that to you, the player. And it's up to you to see through that or not. Most people don't, actually. If you're here, you've been seeing through it this whole time, though. And so I've also talked about, quiet as pause. And I just wanted to mention this, somebody said this in a comment too, and I've said this before too. It's peace and quiet, y'all. What do most people really want in life? They just want a little peace and quiet, and I can relate to that. I think that whole meme of peace and quiet is there as a way of hinting at quiet and pause being the same person, just kind of a transformed, mature versus pre-transformed, immature version of her. And really, Pause herself was, result of a transformation, and it just keeps going back, and there's transformations all the way down. So, anyways, I also wanted to ask the question, just pose it, because I don't really have a great answer for this one. But why do you think they didn't let you get quiet back in the original version of the game they released? Most people might not know this, but when they first released the Phantom Pain, and after Quiet left after you did Mission 45. Finally completed the game, so to speak, Quiet left the base, and you could just never get her back. She was just gone out of the game. And so on PC, modders, almost immediately, I think, patched in a way that you could get her back on base and just kind of have her. But that mod, I don't think, really lived very long, because pretty soon after the game's release, Konami added a patch where you could get Quiet back. And it was kind of a secret thing, but everybody just knew about it as soon as the patch was released, which makes me think that Konami leaked this information on purpose so that people would know how to do it. Sort of like it's PR without having to do all the PR, letting people do the legwork for you. But one thing I wanted to mention is I think that one of the design choices they made in that was you have to replay the fight 7 times, right? You have to do it 7 times and win non-lethally and not shoot her. And at the end of the 7th time will be called a reunion instead of a replay. And at the end of that one, she comes back on the base, and she's there permanently, and she never leaves again, no matter what you do, which is great, because that's the way to play this game, right? I don't think they ever... So going back to the question I'll get to later, but I don't... Well, I'll get to it in a sec. There were 7 times to go through it, and I think if you think of how many times does she pop up in the Metal Gear Solid games, and it's got to be specifically the Metal Gear Solid games. You can't count Metal Gear 1 or 2. You can't count the Acid games or any other games where she might pop up if it doesn't have explicitly Metal Gear Solid in the title. She's in 7 of them. In Metal Gear Solid 3, she's the Joy. In Metal Gear Solid Portable Ops, she's Elisa. In Metal Gear Solid Peace Walker, she's Pause. In Metal Gear Solid V, The Phantom Pain, she's Quiet. In Metal Gear Solid 1, the first one, she's Sniper Wolf. In Metal Gear Solid 2, she's Fortune. And in Metal Gear Solid 4, she's Meryl. There's 7. So maybe that's why they chose 7. Also, 7's kind of a lucky number, It has to do with maybe some Japanese, stuff that I don't fully understand. There might be some cool stuff to look up about that. I'd go look into it. But it might also kind of tie into some of the stuff I'm about to talk about here in a sec. The number 7. So I wanted to say all that. And then I also wanted to say, thing that I was kind of stumbling around earlier with, is that I think they never intended for Quiet to just not be playable again after you complete Mission 45. I don't think they ever intended to leave the game in that state. I think it was released in that state as kind of a directorial statement from Kojima explicitly, and then that statement was sort of like overridden by Konami itself. It's as if Zero had made some authorship to the scenario, and then the greater Cypher Collective all kind of vetoed it and said, "Nah, we're not going to leave it like that, dude. We're going to change it." It's like the other 11 voted against the one dude. He got overruled there. But it was like left in because of his plans, and he had that authorial control up until release, right? And I think that relates back to. So why would Kojima do that? Why would he sort of like cut Quiet from the end of the game, right? Well, I think that it's a hint to yourself, kind of cut Quiet from the game and play through the game from the beginning without her. I think that it changes your experience of this game. Like it's a little bit easier once you get Quiet at Mission 11 and you just start playing through with her. If you're trying to develop everything and struggling through this stuff, all of a sudden when you get Quiet, it gets a lot easier to take on the enemy in open combat. And you can kind of get around having to sneak around a lot because you can kind of take care of a lot of your mistakes and stuff by like sniping a dude that you didn't notice was about to make an alert. So getting Quiet, she's kind of a crutch in a way in terms of your gameplay and in terms of your own ability to get better at this game the first time you're playing through it. If you've got her the whole time helping you, you're still going to be tending to make these mistakes, and you're not going to like really think, oh, I need to stop making these mistakes, because the consequences won't really be there, right? So if you play through this game the first time without Quiet, you'll really have a hard time sneaking through some of those later missions. Like think about some of the total stealth missions, doing them just completely without Quiet. They're kind of tough, DD makes a lot of things really, really easy in this game, don't get me wrong, but it's still easy to like miss some stuff that DD could have, did point out to you and you just missed it, or, miss the sort of the help in combat that Quiet can give you. So with all that said, I think that's one of the reasons why Kojima sort of like released the game with Quiet sort of cuttable from Mission 45, let's say. Another thing I think it could relate to, and this is speculation on my part, is I think if you look at Kojima's relationship with the game over time and kind of compare that to Joy and Zero's relationship over time within the game timeline, it's pretty clear that early on they loved each other, right? There was a lot of strong connection between Joy and Zero. I think that's where Eva and Ocelot came from, and why Ocelot's so fast. He's kind of got the Zero shift power. And so I think that's a way of kind of saying that early on with Kojima and his coming up with all of this story and writing it all, he was probably a lot more attached to it. He felt a lot more joy from it when he first wrote it. And I think as time has gone on, compared to, say 1998 to 2014, he'd probably lost some of that initial joy that he had from making the game. It probably wasn't still there. That's just how it goes, right? That joy that you have in your youth, which is kind of a certain type of feeling, right? That youthful joyfulness, right? There's a kind of like timeless joyfulness that you can feel that everybody feels through all time, but there's kind of this kind of unique kind of feeling you get when everything's still new and you're still young and you're still learning stuff for the first time. You kind of have this youthful kind of energy to your joyfulness, right? And I think that kind of relates to why Zero and Joy kind of have this relationship back in time in the story, right? But when you get to the present day, modern day, these games, it's all kind of a business, right? It's all presumably got some of the joy taken out of it. Once you get away from the writing stage and you get to the actual part where you have to make the game a reality, that's probably where some of the joy would sort of start to, let's say, transform into other ideas, right? Into other experiences and other things. It's not necessarily it becomes worse. It's just that it changes, right? And so that's why I think ultimately it's like there's this distance between Zero and Joy by the end of the series, because Zero is kind of depicted as more of a fatherly influence to a transformed version of her at the end in Metal Gear Solid 4. They're not really like depicted as lovers, right? That's Johnny Sasaki and Meryl. That's really Fox and Joy, right? By the end of it, so which makes sense, kind of like mythologically speaking. Um, in a way, it's like Kojima was sort of like the titan of this like Greek mythology, and he has to like pass on his way, and it has to be like the time for the gods sort of to come along next, in a way of speaking. So that's another reason why maybe Kojima released the game like it was with Mission 45, sort of cutting quiet from your game after you've done that. And that's about all there is to say about the story stuff specifically before the last little bit I'm going to go back over. But we got to talk about the woman as symbol of the divine feminine a little bit here, because that's essentially what Big Quiet's main function in the game is she kind of is the divine feminine within Metal Gear Solid V. Her her quiet nature and her not telling you any of the answers is emblematic in the game itself. The structure of the game itself, it doesn't give you any of its answers easily. You have to earn them yourself. She's just kind of another like a personification of that, really. In fact, she's maybe you could say like the most concentrated personification, because it's in all of the characters, even Venom himself. And maybe if anybody rivals her kind of quietness during the game, it's Venom. Everybody else in this game talks a whole lot more than the two of them, right? Which gets back to their link, like I've talked about. But woman as symbol of divine feminine is an interesting topic that I've been researching just kind of on my own for a while. Male and female energy is typically used in a lot of world mythologies as kind of like the sort of like inherent binary, or a way of understanding the inherent binary in nature. It's depicted in some Eastern mythos as yin and yang, right? You could think of it as sort of like yin is more like existence, and yang, male energy, is more like shaping existence, right? So the yin, the feminine energy, is existence itself, right? So in a way, the way that quiet is so quiet in the game itself is so sort of obstinate to give you any of its sort of revelations, right? You've got to be the one that's shaping the game yourself. You're the one that has to sort of make all the moves and sort of put the pieces in the right place to make things clear all of a sudden, so that the game can speak to you, actually, so that you can share a language. That's another one of the things that Quiet says at the end is, if only we shared a common tongue. Well, the common tongue is sort of like the common shared experience, which is quite literally it's kind of missing. Its existence is here in these missions, but you have to fulfill the rest of the options yourself, sort of like the how you play through it, and even your own understanding of why the story is this way. And that's why I made all these lectures. But in a way, this is like how the universe itself is kind of depicted as a womb in mythologies, kind of in an overarching way. It's kind of seen as like the matrix itself, the matrix of existence itself. Everything that exists is sort of within the universe, right? And so it's like everything that exists sort of is within this feminine coded structure, and the stuff that moves within that structure would be sort of like what we would call the male principle in mythological speak, which was not what we're here to talk about. But let's talk about this word matrix. Of course, that's the movie, all that stuff. But don't think about that movie too much right now. Think about the word matrix. What are its two constituent parts? So the first part is ma, M-A. And that's, for most people, that's self-explanatory. It's kind of a motherly kind of connotation going, or denotation, I guess, there. But the other part of it is Trix, right? Trix. And you typically would see, the one I think of most that gets thrown around, the word I think a lot of people like to say is dominatrix, right? Trix is kind of a feminine coded end of a word, right? It's like I think there's a male version of it that I didn't write it down, But Ma and Trix is sort of like, mother of femininity in a way, is what that means. And this relates to, I think, why people see nature as sort of feminine coded, Mother Nature, right? Sort of like the existence of just stuff, outside of yourself is all kind of seen as inherently feminine coded if it's just like birds and trees and rocks and hills and lakes and all that kind of stuff. It's all, a lot of it's given kind of she and her coding in a lot of ways, right? And that's, that relates back to how it's sort of like, the structure of the world is the thing that is feminine. And it's like you would think of the breeze itself maybe as being the masculine kind of counterpart to the existence there for things like trees. So in Mother Nature, though, there's also things we see as not natural, right? As humans, we see things like pollution. We see parasites as kind of unnatural in a way. That's why we call them parasites and view them the way they do. In a lot of ways, a lot of people see oil as kind of unnatural, right? Not so much the substance itself, but what we do with it, right? The burning of it and the sort of all the vast chemistry that we do to oil to make all the substances that we use to run modern society. A lot of people see that stuff as artificial, as man-made is really what that means. But we also kind of equate this man-madeness with artificiality, with artifice, as if man is not part of nature, you see. Pardon my dog, y'all. So this idea of man not seeing himself as part of nature is really itself the artificial idea. Artifice itself is kind of this idea that we invented to think that there are things out there that are not natural. But all of that viewpoint comes from the idea that man itself is not natural, and that somehow everything that we do is either natural if it fits into what we think of as nature, but if it's not what we think of as nature, it's not natural. It kind of like we kind of go off of a gut feeling. If it fits, it's good. If it doesn't fit, well, it's artificial, right? We talk about artificial sweeteners and things like that, and we understand what this word artificial means, man-made, right? But there's this idea that, artifice is something that it doesn't exist as part of nature, which is kind of silly. We can't really see ourselves as, outside of nature. Who the heck are we to say that? It would take something, like nature itself to say something like that. And how's it going to do that? So, well, maybe if we listened to her, right? Maybe if we paid attention to what she was telling us, right? So anyways, this goes back to what I was saying earlier about how man's, pause being a self-made obstruction, and in this game, you're kind of fighting your own nature, and like how people kind of fight their own egos in a lot of ways by clinging to your ego. This is kind of what artificiality comes out of as well. It's kind of the same idea. It's where a lot of actually really odd human behaviors come from. It really all starts as seeing ourselves as sort of like greater than nature or separate from nature, or like, seeing ourselves as like the smartest thing in the world and blah, blah, blah. It's like, what do we really know? What do we really know if we don't really pay attention, right? And so, yeah, I've got another little note down here about quiet story and motives, but we've kind of covered that enough. But I would say at this point, go back over her story and reanalyze her motives for why she's not talking and why she went after the guy. Like I said, with the parasite in his throat. Now, it's not ever confirmed in the game that the guy had the parasite in his throat, but it happens right before the parasite breakout. So you have to be able to put two and two together yourself. Like I said, this game doesn't give you any of its conclusions, just like Quiet. And with that said, I'm hoping you've enjoyed my conclusions about all of this. And again, this is all kind of my viewpoint. I'm not a representative of Konami, and I wasn't part of the creative process of making this game, so I don't know all this stuff. I'm just a guy who's studied this stuff in books for a while. So anyways, hope you've enjoyed. That's the end of Lecture 25. I'm going to come back with a few more lectures after this. Let me see what I've got written down here. Yeah, I want to do another one on kind of Kojima's method, referential stuff, building your stuff through references. In that one, I'm going to have to give a couple of shout outs to some other creators who have kind of helped me figure out this is what was going on. and just kind of, you know, what all that kind of entails and how he's doing that, and, you know, just kind of the nitty gritty of all the referential stuff that's hiding in, especially the Phantom Pain, and how that all makes the story kind of fill in the gaps itself, right? If you know the referential stuff. I've got another lecture on sort of a story rundown where I want to go back over the timeline at the end of the series, or at the end of the missions, where it just kind of run down the sort of the story of Metal Gear Solid, as you know, as it exists after the Phantom Pain's kind of changes and whatnot, if you want to call it that, and what all that stuff could kind of imply for the future of Metal Gear, and just some ideas I have about the future of Metal Gear 2 will be in that lecture. Or ideas of what it could be is really more accurate probably here. And then I've got one more lecture planned. It's just titled A Brief History of Ruse. If you don't know what the ruse is, you'll want to tune in for that one. I'm not going to say any more about that one. Hope you all have enjoyed. See you next time. Peace.